Hey folks, my name is Phil Kearney. I create role-playing games, I illustrate them, I publish them online. I've been focusing attention on Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition for the past 5 years. There's a slew of links in the description down below to work that I've published that's on DMsGuild.com currently. We're going to add soon in late January 2024, Spelljammer Combat Exploration. We've been working on this project for the past year since Wizards of the Coast released Spelljammer's Adventures in Space for 5th edition. One of the main complaints about that book is that it's thin on rules. It makes it difficult for new DMs to make judgment calls to decide how they can have their campaign flow smoothly. So this book is packed full of ideas, guidance, and processes and procedures for conducting exploration and combat in wild space in the astral sea using Spelljammer mechanics from 5e as the base to grow off of, so that we have more in-depth rules for us to create more intuitive rulings as we run our own campaigns. So we've been spending a video each week here addressing some issues that crop up on Discord channels and subreddits about running games as Spelljammer. And when we were here last week, I'll have a link in the description down below to the conversation about scaling distance over time. So if you're familiar with that video from last week, or you can see it again here, spelljamming ships have a scale of 100 million miles of distance traveled per day. And last week we broke down what those increments of time are in a smaller scale than 1 day. 1 day is 100 million miles, so we can approximate that 2 hours is 10 million miles, and that 10 minutes is approximately, therefore, 1 million miles, and a minute then becomes 100,000 miles, and 6 seconds, the length of a round, is 10,000 miles of distance. That's on a larger global scale of downtime activity and overland travel, where you don't need to worry about specific tactical movement on a round-by-round basis. 10,000 miles per round isn't a very practical unit of time and distance for ship combat. So what we want to do right off the bat is start building a scale that we can operate inside of. So what we have is the action economy. We'll spend time on another session looking at the roles that characters can play aboard ships, but one of the roles that you can play is that of the pilot, using your action economy during combat to move and attack with the ship itself. So if we're going to use character action economy for combat in space, we need to have sensible units of measurement and action, how to use our action economy to move in spirit of how 5e combat typically operates. So the first thing that we do is we break down the 10,000 miles per round to a space of 1,000 miles per square. This is a unit of measurement that can be calculated within the distance that the ship can possibly move within 1 round at maximum speed. So looking at the mechanics that we have here in the book, a pilot can move a ship up to 5 squares each round, similar to walking 25 feet at the 5-foot scale using your move action. You can then use the dash action to move your ship an additional 5 squares. So if we're working with squares that are 1,000 miles in scale, 10 squares at 1,000 miles is going to be 1 square of 10,000 miles, or 1 unit of movement during a round. Capping at 10,000 miles means at most you can move up to 10 squares per round using your action as dash along with movement as a normal character would on a 5-foot scale map. But 1,000 mile squares are not very practical. The DMG, Saltmarsh, and Spelljammers in Space provide normal ranges for siege weapons. A ballista has a range of 500 feet. A mangonel has a range of 1,000, and a trebuchet about 1,500 feet. So if we're going to use a practical scale of combat, anything beyond these 500-foot square increments is not practical for us to be able to attack with siege weapons. So that helps build a base mechanic for what scale of combat we want to operate in. 1,000 miles squares is the maximum scale possible for a ship. So 1,000 to 100 miles to 10 miles to 1 miles. You can't tell the difference between 1,000 miles and 1 mile or even 500 feet at this scale. A Star Moth, this ship that we're depicting here in Square A, this is a Star Moth. It's a 200-foot ship, while this galleon is a 130-foot long ship. Both of these things fit inside of one 500-foot square. Consider this to be like a pixie in a dungeon. Pixies are tiny-sized creatures about 2 feet in height, and they are occupying a 5-foot scale. If the Star Moth were instead a pixie, it would be similarly depicted in that the pixie image would fill the 5-foot space that it is occupying, because 5-foot spaces, a 5-foot square is the smallest increment of distance that is used for combat in Dungeons and Dragons out of the Player's Handbook, DMG, and Monster Manual. So similarly, a 200-foot long ship can occupy a single 500-foot square. So if we are now operating at the 500-foot scale, you could, using your action economy at this slower, more concentrated, more intent distance, instead of just casually sipping a cola flying on at 10,000 miles per round, you need to scale down and maneuver within range of combat so you can hit things with your siege weapons. So the maximum scale of combat that we depict is 500-foot squares. If you move out to 1 or more miles per square, you're effectively exiting the range of combat, because even though you could you could use a ballista to attack as normal without disadvantage up to 500 feet, you could theoretically still hit something more than a mile away. But if they're more than a mile away, they're literally going to see this bolt coming at them, or a big stone being lobbed at them from literally a mile away. They can see it coming a mile away. So if they're not surprised, if they're aware that they're in combat, all attacks automatically miss, unless for some reason the ship, the pilot would want to be targeted with that attack. If you're sneaking up on somebody and taking a sniper shot at them, you could be 100 miles away. It's just going to take a while for that weapon, for that attack to get to its destination. And if they become aware of that attack at any point during that process, they could just slide out of the way and it shoots by, because they have more action economy to move their ship than that weapon has time to be able to close that distance. So that means that 500-foot squares is the maximum scale of combat that needs to be depicted with the weapons that are available in Spelljammer. If we eventually publish a laser plasma railgun sort of sci-fi setting book, then we can have higher, larger scales of movement depicted in combat, because you'd have a further range that would be able to hit instant, like a laser could potentially fire like, say, 100 miles away and still have enough magnitude to damage the opponent when it hits, for example. But with these archaic weapons, the charm of the ship of the line depiction of pirate combat using wooden ships or similar type vessels in Spelljammer is that they can move incredibly fast, but have these ridiculously short ranges of combat to engage in. So you have to slow your ship down to be able to properly target and have combat at these smaller scales. So if this was a 500-foot scale, this would be 500, 1,000, this would be 1,500 feet away. You could still shoot at each other with ballistas, but you'd be at disadvantage because you're beyond the normal 500-foot range. Or, like if you were using trebuchets, you'd be within normal range at this distance. Ships have the ability to move up to 5 squares and take shots or do whatever action economy you want as a pilot. Or if you really want to double down, you can use the dash action to have even more distance. If you move outside of a mile of range, you lose combat and you're now in a pursuit. And we'll discuss pursuit in another session. But as long as you stay within 1 mile of each other, you can still make attacks at each other. So that's a 500-foot scale. The way that Wizards of the Coast depicts ship combat is to take your 2 ships and have them become adjacent to each other at the 5-foot scale, so that you can have characters and creatures go across the deck, like hop the railing between ships and fight each other at the 5-foot scale of combat, as though these were 2 fortresses or 2 dungeon rooms placed next to each other for you to conduct normal 5e combat. The general rule of production for Wizards of the Coast in 5th edition is to curve every idea that you have into working with mechanics that already exist. In earlier editions, they would create new mechanics to accommodate the new fantasy or the new style of play and build rules around that. But that takes a lot of play testing that they generally don't invest the time to do, and a lot of brain power, which they generally don't have the staff to offer. So they build everything to curve into what already exists. Couture designers like myself and other people that are on the DMsGuild or creating Kickstarter projects don't have that limitation necessarily. We have the time that we need to be able to build out the mechanics and build what's necessary to depict the kind of game that we want to play, which is what we curve into with this. So 500-foot scale, there's a transition from this 1,000 miles to 100 to 10 to 1 to 500 feet down then into the 5-foot scale to get to where Wizards of the Coast wants you to be in combat, face to face at the 5-foot scale, using all of your character's features as intended. So how do we get there? There's a scale between 500 to 50 to 5 feet. There's 3 stages of transition. So you can see here, these squares could be anything from 500 to 1,000 mile squares. If we're looking at overland movement, these could be 100 million mile squares, where it takes an entire day to move 1 square at a time. But in combat with 6-second rounds, obviously we can move far more than what we need to for the range of combat. If you can move 10,000 miles per round, moving 5 feet to close distance with another ship is going to require you to be to pay close attention, the pilot paying attention, maintaining concentration, have that focus to be able to close that distance without causing collision or wrecking each other, while still being able to be engaged in combat. So we have a 500-foot scale here, and then we can shift into closing distance during our action economy to the 50-foot scale, and then to the 5-foot scale finally here, to be able to have characters and creatures engaging in 5-foot scale combat. But all 3 of these scales of distance exist at the same time. You can depict ships engaging in combat with each other at the 500-foot scale, while you're also conducting battle at the 50-foot scale, and having creatures fighting each other at the 5-foot scale. And the way that we achieve that is by depicting different scales during combat. On this map over here, we're looking at the 500-foot scale. Spoiler alert for anybody that's interested in the Light of Xeraxis adventure. Too late. So there is a 1-mile fortress citadel that exists. That, as you can see here, a 1-mile space is a 10 by 10 grid space at the 500-foot scale. So this fortress here is the home for a fleet of ships at the 500-foot scale that can move to intercept potential attacking vessels here, depicted at, here's the citadel at point A, here is a defending fleet of ships at point B. Again, we're looking at that 500-foot scale, so it's just filling the space that it occupies against the attacking fleet C. But when these 2 ships are in adjacent squares with each other, we can then zoom in on a separate 10 by 10 grid here, facing another 10 by 10 grid here. When we zoom in, we can actually see what's going on inside of this 500-foot space. Here we're looking at a selection of ships, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 versus 8 ships, right? Well, we'll look at it in a separate section later on in another recording about how we can track vessels and fighter craft as squadrons inside of larger squares. So here we're looking at squadrons of these star moths and flitter ships engaging a squadron of hammerhead ships, as you can see depicted here at A, B, and then C. We're using this arrow here to indicate one of these ships, one of these star moths, or sorry, little flitter ships here, closing distance. So we can conduct combat at the 500-foot scale for ranged siege weapons. We can conduct battle at the 50-foot scale. All these ships have, like these star moths, they have slashing rams. The hammerhead ship, it has a bludgeoning ram. There's different types of melee weapons that ships can be equipped with to attack each other. When you have a vessel that occupies more than one 50-foot space, that ship can make melee attacks against other large-sized craft at the 50-foot scale. This is effectively a gargantuan creature. If this was a 5-foot scale, this 20 by 20 space that this creature would be filling would be considered gargantuan, and it would have a reach of 20 feet. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this gargantuan creature at the 5-foot scale could attack with melee weapons during normal melee combat with an attack action, a siege melee weapon on your ship, like your slashing ram or your bludgeoning ram here, to deal slashing, bludgeoning damage to each other's ships in melee combat. If you've ever seen Outlaw Star, the anime, they had grappling weapons and melee weapons on their spaceships, as well as ranged lasers and other type of weapons as well. It's a really fun analogy for how this system works. Outlaw Star, check it out, super cool. But then there's fighter craft that are 50 feet or smaller. We've talked about fighter craft before, and we're going to keep talking about them in future episodes as well. But a fighter craft can then use its action economy here. We got what? Let's look at this here. So we got an arrow here indicating you're starting here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares, right? This one's going starting here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares. That's a move action. Both of these ships can take a move action to then close distance at the 50-foot scale. If they want to move more at this point, they would have to use a dash action to get more movement into their action economy for the round. In this instance here, we're seeing a flitter, an elven flitter ship, start here and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the 50-foot scale, move an additional 5 squares using the dash action. With the fleet, it moved 5 squares at the 500-foot scale. At the 50-foot scale, zooming in, we can see what we're actually fighting in the fleets. And these little fighter craft are using additional action economy as a dash action from the pilot to close enough distance to actually board a ship. So we zoom in again here at the 5-foot scale. This is another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 by 10 square. Another 10 by 10 square. And another 10 by 10 square. 3 10 by 10 squares that we can break up a 250-foot long ship into these separate squares of 10 by 10 spaces. So this star moth as a 10-foot square space, or as a 10 square 5-foot space, occupies and lands on this hammerhead ship. And now we can see that the pilot used their action economy to move to close distance, move again to actually board the craft. And now all of these elven fighters and warriors that were on board the ship in the tail landing section of this craft, that opens up, and now all these individual creatures can use their action economy to then move out at 30 feet or whatever their speed is per round, but then to move out and start taking over the ship, fighting any creatures that fight them along the way at the 5-foot scale, exactly as described as Wizards of the Coast. So what we're introducing into this document is a means for us to have a fluid movement from the 100 million miles per day to then zoom in so that you can be conducting combat and melee combat and siege combat at the 500 to 50-foot scale, and then you get bored at the 5-foot scale if somebody wants to. If you don't want to, then you start playing keep away at this larger scale of distance, conducting ranged combat and melee combat disengage actions, dodge actions to try to keep away from your enemy ship. If you don't want to get boarded, you want to be able to get away from the craft, open up distance, and get out of 1 mile range so you can leave combat. And if that Star Moth really wants to chase you down and board your ship, they're going to then have to start engaging in pursuits. So we'll come back and we'll address pursuits at another time. But this is just a quick look-see at what kind of scaling systems, mechanics that we use inside of this book. This whole document's a little bit more than 100 pages. The first 80 some odd pages are full of combat mechanics like this, as well as a deep dive into exploration, visibility, the movement of planetary systems inside of a spelljamming system, how to be able to calculate distances based on familiarity through the astral sea. There's a lot of just little mechanics and little quality of life details that provide enough baseline mechanics rules so that DMs that pick up the book and read through it will have just a general background information and idea about how space physics can work, so you can start making your own rulings to build your own campaign, and hopefully be able to refer back to this document if you have a question about how would I be able to interact with something. Like if I want to throw an asteroid at a star base, how much damage am I going to do to that base if it gets hit by an asteroid as a collision, and how many ships exactly am I going to need to be able to pull that asteroid as a weapon to be able to lob at that base. So these are some of the things that we can do inside this book, and we'll be touching on them as we continue going along. When I'm recording this is December 30th, 2023. It looks like we're going to have this book done by the end of January 2024. So we'll be putting out weekly videos like this just to take a little snippet look at what's inside the book until it's finished. And once it is, we'll put it all into a PDF. We'll publish it on the DMsGuild like all the other stuff down below, and you'll have an extensive free preview for you guys to check it out. We're going to have a token packet of different creatures, ships, and NPCs from Light of Xeraxis that we're going to place on the DMsGuild, and we're going to have a lot of Light of Xeraxis maps and NPCs and ships that you'd be fighting included with this document as well. So you can keep an eye out for some heavy discounts in a bundle as a discount package to thank everybody for being involved and taking interest in the project. So once we publish, I'll be shouting from the rooftops that it's active and everyone should check it out. So stick around, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon. You can check in the description down below to the Discord channel that we have up and running now for this and other projects that I'm working on. And hope to see you guys again soon. Thanks a lot for being here. Cheers.